Good morning. The 14th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. The Assembly will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 8, entitled General Debate. I now give the floor to His Excellency Osman Saleh Mohammed, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Eritrea.
Good morning. Your Excellency Ms. Annalena Borbak, President of the 8th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Your Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, honorable heads of delegation, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Madam President, allow me to join previous speakers to congratulate Your Excellency for your election to the presidency of the 8th session of the United Nations General Assembly. During the 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly last year, I had briefly reflected as a backdrop and for purposes of historical reference to dwell on humanity's collective trajectory in the past 100 years. In this regard, the defining features of this century can be summed up by failure formed in 1995 and until the end of the Cold War, and reckless and dangerous trends set in motion in the prevalent unipolar world order in the last 30 years. As we all agree, the League of Nations and the United Nations were originally conceived as viable architectures of global governance to advance the pronounced lofty objectives that we all cherish. In this respect, and at a time when humanity is aspiring for a transition from the old, defunct global order to a new one, the overarching quest must revolve around finding outside tangential ideological acrimonies, enduring solutions to fundamental and outstanding problems that our global community continues to grapple with. Economic injustice has remained the primary challenge for mankind and all the peoples as a whole since ancient times, from primitive social systems to the epochs of slavery and colonization, all the way until our contemporary times in a developed 21st century. The perennial challenges stem from modalities of wealth creation and accumulation, and notably in relation to wealth and income sharing. The fact is, past and present global systems are broadly rooted on monopoly, plunder, and deceit. Domination and attendant policies crafted to that end, military power that is garnered, and military assaults unleashed are indeed mere tools of domination and plunder. Similarly, various economic and financial architectures are essentially enunciated to bolster the objectives of domination and plunder. Policies formulated and operations undertaken to expand the spheres of influence are likewise sheer means of domination and plunder. Subtle corruption constitutes another means of domination and plunder. Wars, conflicts, and crises are also stoked and aggravated for the sole purpose of domination and plunder. Tools of propaganda and deception are weaponized for similar objectives. Ladies and gentlemen, In the event, the cardinal challenge is how to bring about a new global order that promotes justice and fairness to supplant prevailing global governance architecture whose defining contours remain domination, plunder, deceit, and repression. Spiraling oppositions underway in various parts of our world, including in the developed and industrialized regions, through expansive popular demonstrations against dire economic trends and debilitating debt anchored by governments, are only the tip of the iceberg. But what is extremely preoccupying is the appalling economic situation in the underdeveloped countries, and more specifically in the marginalized African continent. Although the details can be assessed on a case-by-case basis, most of Africa's economy remains primitive. Africa remains a continent where raw materials are exported to the so-called developed economies for nominal prices, in which manufactured finished products are imported at highly inflated prices, where the economies are afflicted by huge losses in job opportunities, in which human capital and meager professional and skilled manpower are drained due to migration and brain drain, where presiding regimes lavishly waste borrowed money but cynically flaunt semblance of progress while burdened by mounting debt, are embroiled in corruption and political servitude to external forces, are afflicted by instability due to domestic polarization and endemic crisis, and where they face rapid population growth as well as imminent challenges and disasters. The scenario is very bleak indeed. Why was mankind's mission in the new century unsuccessful? The cherished mission does not contain novel and sophisticated inventions or ideological and philosophical dimensions. The values of the missions invoked and that underpin the struggle during the epochs of slavery have not changed whatsoever in this so-called new 20th century. The aspirations of mankind are: 1, to fairly own their economic resources and the fruits of their work and march on a sustainable path of generational progress and prosperity by accumulating wealth. 2, to secure peace and stability in order to guarantee prosperity and economic growth. 3, to ensure prevalence of fairness and justice as vital prerequisites for peace and stability. To promote mutual respect, complementarity, and cohesion integration, so as to bolster widest regional and global peace and stability, as well as mutual growth. 5, to establish appropriate legal executive structure and associated mechanisms for the implementation of these fundamental human aspirations. Ladies and gentlemen, although mankind's aspirations have not been realized as yet, its cherished aspirations cannot be shelved or postponed. Failure to achieve the desired objectives can only spur stronger resilience and greater moral imperative. In the event, the timely and pressing task for all the peoples of the world is to strengthen their organizational and coordination mechanisms in order to prevail against perennial injustices, domination, deceit, coercion, intimidation, plunder, and monopolization, whatnot. In this regard, we call for the categorical lifting of all unilateral coercive measures and sanctions imposed on countries such as Eritrea, and Cuba, including the unjust 60-year-long embargo against Cuba and its arbitrary designation on the spurious list of state sponsors of terrorism. This will require nurturing broad mechanisms of solidarity as well as continuous review and refinement of their strategies and methodologies. In this respect, the peoples of Africa should particularly work out, in view of the specific hurdles that they are facing, a robust mechanism in order to contribute their share with higher vigor to the collective mission for a new world order in tandem with ongoing endeavors for the consolidation of a broad international alliance. Ladies and gentlemen, on the occasion of the 80th session of the ANGA, I would like to mention that in the interest of time, I have chosen not to delve into vital issues pertaining to palpable shortcomings of the United Nations and its various agencies, along with possible remedial measures, as well as the various initiatives underway by several parties for the crystallization of a new global order. I thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Eritrea. I now give the floor to His Excellency Alva Romanus Baptiste, Minister for External Affairs, International Trade, Civil Aviation and Diaspora Affairs of St. Lucia.
Madam President, in the words of the late Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, the most reliable way to predict the future is to create it. The words of the late President are illuminated by Buckminster Fuller, who said, and I quote, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete," unquote. Hence, Madam President, the theme for this 80th session of the United Nations, Better Together, 80 years and more for peace, development, and human rights, is a trumpet call to like-minded countries to urgently reconstruct a better future for humanity. Building that better future together emphasizes the importance of international cooperation and shared responsibility. It requires a framework defining a shared destiny, and that involves better coordination and coherence across multiple actors to deliver the most effective and sustainable responses. In this regard, Madam President, St. Lucia, as a small island developing state, has maintained its engagement in the various processes of critical importance to its domestic agenda at the United Nations, such as climate change and sustainable development, financing for development, international ocean governance, the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, revitalization of the General Assembly, and decolonization. These all have a real impact on our national plans and programs. In the context of our development challenges, the global economy is facing multiple shocks that are threatening to further retard and reverse progress on St. Lucia's sustainable development. The impacts of these compounding shocks is aggravated by an unfair global financial system that is short-term oriented and crisis-prone, which further exacerbate inequalities. Not to mention that small island developing states like St. Lucia face existential threats amplified by climate change. Despite some skeptics, Madam President, there is no doubt that climate change is the most consequential and formidable challenge facing seeds. In fact, the latest scientific projections portend a grim future. Consequently, addressing the climate crisis is imperative for the survival and well-being of humanity, transcending national borders regardless of size or wealth. Prioritizing climate action is not just an environmental issue, but a moral obligation to protect human life, uphold global stability, and ensure a sustainable and equitable future for all of humanity. The recent advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which was requested by this very General Assembly, now also frames climate action as a legal responsibility. Hence, there is an urgent need to accelerate global momentum towards the ambitious targets across various international agreements and development agendas. A common thread across these instruments is the need to address the unique vulnerabilities and special circumstances of small island developing states. Madam President, we also work in the UN context to strengthen relations with countries and regions and encourage cooperation while remaining staunch advocates of the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, the rule of law, and the process of multilateralism. And St. Lucia agrees with the UN Secretary General that, and I quote, multilateralism is not an option but a necessity as we build back a better world with more equality and resilience and a more sustainable world. For we are confronted with challenges and threats largely emanating from the unilateral actions of powerful developed countries. And it is through the multilateral system of the United Nations that we can find comfort and the support to meet these challenges. However, the erosion of global trust, intensified by geopolitical divisions, economic disparities, and ongoing crises, threatens international cooperation and stability. As nations prioritize self-interest over collective well-being, diplomatic relations weaken and multilateral efforts falter. Madam President, while global solidarity is essential to uphold human rights, it is also important to support self-determination, especially for marginalized and colonized nations. Recognizing the right to independence fosters justice, equality, and dignity, and builds inclusive, sovereign societies that reinforce the universal principle that all peoples deserve freedom and self-governance. It is for this reason, Madam President, that the world must act urgently to bring an end to the gruesome carnage and injustices being perpetrated against the Palestinian people. And this must start with the implementation of the scores of resolutions that have been passed by the UN since 1947, which call for the Palestinians to exercise their right to self-determination. Madam President, I draw attention in particular to Resolution 3246 of 1974, which reaffirmed the unassailable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, national independence and sovereignty, and the right of the Palestinians to return to their homes and property. In St. Lucia's reaffirmation of its commitment to human dignity, equality, and justice, Madam President, the ongoing Israeli military operations in Gaza and the West Bank raise serious concerns about the humanitarian impact on innocent civilians, which has exceeded disturbing, alarming, and unacceptable parameters. Madam President, dropping bombs on civilian populations, on defenseless men, women, and children cannot constitute a defense of oneself. Using starvation as a method of so-called warfare cannot constitute defense of oneself. Madam President, the destruction of hospitals, schools, and places of worship in Palestine in no way constitute self-defense and are completely unacceptable, inhumane, and atrocious. Is it surprising to anyone, therefore, that based on publicly available data from United Nations and other agencies, at least 66,053 Palestinians have been killed, 65,062 in Gaza, and 991 in the West Bank, and of the identified fatalities, at least 18,430 are children. Further, at least 247 journalists and 540 aid or humanitarian workers have been killed since October 7th, 2023. Madam President, in this morbid scenario, we must remind ourselves that this is not a video game. This is not science fiction, and Palestinians are not imaginary people. They are human beings deserving of our collective respect, independence, and protection. Recognizing the fact of the shared humanity of both Israelis and Palestinians should cause us to value equally the life of an Israeli and the life of a Palestinian. This would lead naturally to the fostering of dialogue and peaceful solutions to ensure security and stability for all parties involved, because respecting human rights and protecting all civilian lives must remain at the forefront of international efforts to resolve the conflict constructively. Madam President, St. Lucia's position is abundantly clear that there is an urgent need to put an end to the intolerable and significant human suffering, civilian casualties, and widespread destruction. And St. Lucia joins with the majority of member states which continue to call for de-escalation, dialogue, and adherence to international law to prevent further loss of life and foster a sustainable path toward peace. The Palestinians must have their own state and full membership to the United Nations alongside the state of Israel. The only way for Israel to have secure borders is for the Palestinian people to live in their own internationally recognized homeland in accordance with the universal right to self-determination. Peace in the Middle East can only come from this, not from bombs and wars, and terrorism and genocide and illegal settlements. Madam President, clearly, lasting peace cannot be secured on the basis of extremism. It must be pursued on the premise of mutual respect for the lives of both Israelis and Palestinians. Madam President, I speak to you today as one who's conscious of how the transatlantic slave trade inflicted unimaginable suffering, dehumanization, and economic exploitation upon millions of Africans. This is why we are adamant about our just cause for reparations from Europe for the African slave trade, which are a moral imperative rooted in justice and acknowledgement of profound historical injustices that have long-lasting consequences. Unsurprisingly, St. Lucia will sustain its condemnation of the atrocities being committed against the Palestinian people, rooted in decades of oppression, including the systemic undermining of Palestinian statehood. Madam President, since 1992, the United Nations General Assembly has consistently and overwhelmingly voted for the removal of the economic sanctions imposed by the United States on Cuba. It is time for all to respect and uphold the will of the General Assembly. Madam President, St. Lucia has consistently called for an end to the U.S. embargo on Cuba and its removal from the list of state sponsors of terrorism because we embrace the view that engaging Cuba diplomatically rather than isolating it would unlock opportunities to foster regional cooperation, critical for long-term peace and development in the Caribbean, as well as to create an improved security architecture for the entire hemisphere. This pragmatic approach aligns with global efforts to promote sovereignty, respect, and mutual understanding, demonstrating that diplomacy and constructive dialogue are more effective strategies than universal sanctions. Madam President, ending Russia's war in Ukraine is essential to restoring peace, respecting sovereignty, and preventing further humanitarian catastrophe. The ongoing conflict has caused immense loss of life, displacement of millions, and widespread destruction, destabilizing the region and threatening global security. Hence, ceasing hostilities would demonstrate respect for international law and sovereignty, encouraging negotiations over continued violence. Madam President, renewing our commitment to multilateralism also means that member states must take measures to reduce tensions and settle disputes in areas where, if not checked, conflict and war would prevail. It is for this reason that St. Lucia renews calls for the United Nations to allow Taiwan to meaningfully participate in the UN system. And I state categorically, Madam President, that UN Resolution 2758 of 1971 does not preclude Taiwan's inclusion and participation in the United Nations system. Madam President, Haiti faces an unprecedented humanitarian crisis marked by political instability, widespread poverty, environmental degradation, and a fragile healthcare system, all compounded by intractable gang violence. Hence, the urgent need for international support is critical to prevent further deterioration of living conditions, protect vulnerable populations, and restore law and order, as well as basic services like education and healthcare. Without immediate action, Haiti risks spiraling into deeper chaos, increased violence, and prolonged suffering that will destabilize the region and undermine global efforts for stability and development. This is why St. Lucia is extremely concerned that the multinational security support mission is woefully short of the personnel and equipment it needs to effectively pursue its mandate. Of the $900 million the UN anticipated raising for Haiti, only 9.2% of this has been received. The UN Secretary General has best described this, and I quote, as shamefully overlooked and woefully underfunded, unquote. Madam President, on the 29th of January 2014, the leaders of the Community of Latin America and Caribbean states declared our region as a zone of peace. It was a declaration based on a commitment to upholding the principles of the UN Charter. It was based on the understanding that peace was necessary for the development of the peoples of the region, and that peace in the region contributed to international peace and security. As recently as the 13th of June this year, at the Brazil-Caribbean Summit in Brasilia, the heads of government reaffirmed their commitment to maintaining the region as a zone of peace. It is in this context, therefore, that St. Lucia, like other CARICOM member states, views with concern recent developments in the region which have aggravated tensions between Venezuela and the United States. We pray, Madam President, that this tension does not degenerate into violence, hence maintaining our region as a zone of peace. It is also in the context of the Latin American and Caribbean region as a zone of peace, that St. Lucia is concerned over developments between Venezuela and the CARICOM member state of Guyana in relation to the border dispute between the two countries. St. Lucia urges the non-use of force on that issue and reliance on the multilateral mechanisms that are in place for resolving it. St. Lucia prioritizes diplomacy over violence, believing dialogue fosters peaceful coexistence and safeguards sovereignty. Small nations like ours can advocate effectively through non-violent diplomacy, demonstrating its moral and pragmatic strength, Madam President. Consequently, Madam President, we have a moral obligation to promote peace, development, and human rights through collective leadership rooted in respect, diplomacy, and multilateral cooperation. However, Madam President, we have to accept that the UN's commission is being ignored and disrespected when we witness the undeniable genocide that is being committed against the people of Palestine. Further, the recent attacks on Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and Qatar speak to the violation of the UN Charter, which has now become normalized. We cannot deny that the UN's commission is being snubbed and disregarded when, after 3 years, Russia continues to flout international law and the UN Charter with its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Similarly, the UN's commission is also being ignored in the 63-year-old unproductive economic embargo that has been imposed on the government and people of Cuba, despite the many UN resolutions calling for its removal. And we have to agree that the UN's commission is being disregarded in the conflict in the Sudan. These shocks to the UN's commission should be of concern to all member states, but they are of particular concern to all small island developing states like St. Lucia, not just because these conflicts threaten world peace in general, but because they are symptomatic of a departure from multilateralism and the adoption of an outdated notion that might is right. Clearly, Madam President, violence is not in consonance with the requirements of our times. In fact, it is abundantly clear that military dominance, which is an expired currency of a bygone era, is not moral tender and cannot purchase peace and stability in the contemporary global political environment. The old military order, though fraught with contradictions, is pregnant with renewal. Without guidance, its offspring may be disfigured by conflict. But with diplomacy as the midwife, this troubled gestation can deliver a new era of peace and stability. The world's intolerance for the carnage in Gaza and the West Bank is symptomatic of its resentment for needless bloodshed. While military dominance enables death and destruction, it cannot resolve the spectrum of challenges that we as a global family are called upon to confront within the framework of our integrated whole. So, Madam President, the UN 80 initiative is essential to revitalize the UN's effectiveness amid crisis, enhancing multilateralism to restore trust and address issues like climate change and inequality. Madam President, despite challenges like limited enforcement, vetoes, and geopolitical interests, the UN remains a valuable conflict resolution tool. We should leverage the UN to advance economic and social priorities and a stronger international response to global issues. Hence, a new model for the United Nations should prioritize reforming its decision-making processes to enhance efficiency, accountability, and inclusivity, addressing current limitations like veto power and bureaucratic inertia. This model would shift towards a more equitable representation, empowering developing countries and marginalized groups ensuring their voices influence global solutions. It would strengthen the UN's capacity for rapid response to crises, integrating innovative approaches like technology and multi-stakeholder partnerships. By fostering transparency and accountability, this new model would rebuild global trust, making the UN a more effective, responsive, and equitable platform for advancing peace, sustainable development, and human rights in an increasingly interconnected world. This model, Madam President, will give birth to an international environment of peace, of the absence of major conflicts and wars, of the decline of unilateralism, of a greater function in multilateralism that protects us from climate change and climate injustice, from the scourge of illegal weapons smuggled into our countries, an international environment where nations honor their financial commitments and responsibilities and respond and respect and promote human rights that supports our efforts at regional integration. Madam President, as I prepare to close, this model would be a fine testament that after 80 years, multilateralism would be in a good place, and that with the United Nations, we can expect that in the years ahead, there will be more peace, greater development, and the prevalence of human rights. Let us choose it, my dear brothers and sisters. Let us reach for it, my dear brothers and sisters, because after all, in the words of Buckminster Fuller, we are called to be architects of the future, not its victims. Madam President, I yield the floor.
I thank the Minister for External Affairs, International Trade, Civil Aviation and Diaspora Affairs of St. Lucia. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mulambo Hamakuni Haimbe, Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Zambia.
Your Excellency, Madam Annalena Baerbock, President of the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, distinguished delegates. I am honored to address this August Assembly on behalf of Mr. Hakainde Hichilema, President of the Republic of Zambia. Allow me, at the outset, to congratulate you, Madam President, on your election to the presidency of the 80th session of the General Assembly. The choice of theme, Better Together, 80 years and more for peace, development, and human rights, is timely as it underscores the need for us to work together for the common good in the face of multiple global challenges. In this regard, Zambia reaffirms its faith in multilateralism and the United Nations Charter, a key foundation for our shared commitment to international peace and cooperation. Over the past 8 decades, the United Nations has been the cornerstone of global peace, security, and cooperation. It has helped prevent major conflicts, advanced decolonization, supported peacekeeping missions, and played a leading role in advancing global action in public health, education, and humanitarian relief that have saved countless lives. Through initiatives such as the Sustainable Development Goals, it has mobilized nations to reduce poverty, improve public health and education, as well as promoted gender equality. We also note that peace is intrinsically intertwined with development, as there can be no sustainable development in the absence of peace. Therefore, the UN's efforts at peace building and peacekeeping are very critical for the development of all regions of the world, even those seemingly distant from the war front. We recognize, however, that the UN has been slow to react to some of the conflict situations which has led to serious humanitarian crises. We also acknowledge the need for key reforms and genuine inclusiveness, particularly for Africa, whose voice remains stifled after 8 decades. We must reflect on this and other areas that could be enhanced. Those challenges remain. The United Nations has proved that multilateralism can deliver tangible progress for humanity. We are confident that the Pact for the Future and the Declaration on Future Generations agreed upon during the 79th session renews our hope and solidarity to sustain the momentum of the past 80 years. Madam President, as we undertake these reforms, it will be important to ensure that the pursuit of efficiency should not be at the expense of the United Nations' reach and impact on the interests of developing countries, particularly those facing the largest implementation gaps in the SDGs. The UN 80 initiative must strengthen delivery in the 3 core pillars of the United Nations of peace and security, development and human rights. We must preserve those parts of the UN that work. For instance, the resident coordinator system has helped coordinate various UN development agencies to ensure they work together effectively, efficiently, and transparently in supporting the host governments achieve SDGs. These reforms must serve to strengthen the RC system. Madam President, we meet at a critical moment when escalation in geopolitical tensions pose a significant threat to the gains made in the 80 years of the United Nations' existence. This exacerbates the existing challenges and places multilateralism under threat. Further, we have witnessed how challenges such as ongoing conflict situations, climate shocks, and the pandemic have negatively impacted the global economy. It is therefore clear that a short period of war or crisis can erase decades of development gains. We therefore categorically condemn war and aggression and urge all parties in conflict to choose diplomacy over violence. Allow me to re-echo President Hakainde Hichilema's constant reminder to the world that instability anywhere is instability everywhere. Zambia therefore remains an advocate for peace, human rights, good governance, and inclusive development for a strengthened multilateral system. Further, we remain committed to the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Zambia has been actively engaged in regional peace efforts. We continue to support the work of the African Union and regional organizations in mediation and peacekeeping, including in the Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes region. Here at the United Nations, we as African nations count on the continued support of the international community in initiatives to silence the guns in Africa and resolve conflict worldwide for a more secure world. Madam President, inspired by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and our national vision, we have undertaken bold reforms to improve the lives of our people, even as we recover from the devastating drought that affected our country in 2024. A cornerstone of our strategy is investing in our people, especially the youth. Believing that education is the greatest equalizer, our government introduced free primary and secondary education for all children, recruited a number of teachers to improve the quality of education. We further recognize that a healthy population underpins productivity and inclusive growth. Zambia therefore remains steadfast in its pursuit of health for all by building resilience, equitable and accessible health systems. We are expanding infrastructure, providing essential supplies, and deploying thousands of health workers to underserved areas, among other interventions. While we recognize the changing landscape in official development assistance, we call on development partners to continue their effort to support HIV/AIDS programs, especially with antiretroviral therapy, so that countries such as Zambia that have made progress in the fight against HIV do not regress on account of funding constraints. We therefore look forward to upcoming World Social Summit in Qatar that will accord us an opportunity to engage on key social development issues and advance social progress, ensuring that no one is left behind in the global sustainable development journey. We urge all member states and development partners to prioritize health spending as a strategic investment because human capital is the greatest asset of any nation. Madam President, to protect the most vulnerable, Zambia has scaled up safety nets. Our social cash transfer program now reaches over 6.5% households. This and other complementary initiatives such as food security packs and skills training has been crucial in cushioning families from shocks and lifting communities out of extreme poverty. Madam President, we believe that empowering women is more than just a moral duty. When women thrive, families prosper and nations advance. We therefore place women and youth at the center of our transformation through affirmative measures that enhance women's participation in decision-making and protect their careers and families. We continue to lead efforts to eliminate gender-based violence and child marriage through strengthening laws and community awareness programs. We call on the international community to redouble efforts towards gender equality, especially as we commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Women's Conference and Beijing Program of Action. Madam President, Zambia's economy, like many other developing countries, has endured turbulent times in recent years. Upon assuming office, our government's highest priority was to restore macroeconomic stability, which we are steadily delivering. We implemented difficult but necessary reforms to restructure our public debt in order to create fiscal space. This debt restructuring, alongside our ongoing IMF-supported program, has put Zambia firmly on a path to debt sustainability and renewed investor confidence. However, stabilizing the economy is only the first step. We equally focused on reigniting growth and economic transformation through diversification. Madam President, the existential threat of climate change looms over all our aspirations. Despite our minimal contribution to global emissions, many developing countries often experience increased frequency of climate shocks, such as droughts and destructive floods. In this regard, we look ahead with a hope to the upcoming COP30 in Brazil, which will mark the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. This milestone conference must be a turning point from promises to action. Zambia has submitted its revised National Determined Contribution, NDC 3.0, and we therefore encourage other countries to do the same with enhanced ambition to be within the reach of the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. We must act now to limit global warming and to adapt to its effects. Let us summon the political will for bold action that safeguards the planet for future generations. Madam President, 5 years to the year 2030, only 17% of SDGs are on track. We also note that several developing countries remain fiscally constrained in directing sufficient resources towards SDGs on account of increasing debt burdens, highlighting the need to strengthen mechanisms for resolving debt crises. Against this backdrop, Zambia was privileged to have co-facilitated the outcome document of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, which unanimously adopted the Seville Commitment. This outcome has renewed global consensus to close the $4 trillion annual SDG financing gap. It is now time to move from commitments to action. We call on all nations, development banks, and the private sector to align their policies and investments with the SDGs. Official development assistance, a lifeline for less developed countries, must be protected. There is need to scale up domestic resource mobilization, embracing innovative financing mechanisms, tackling illicit financial flows, and promoting private sector involvement. Madam President, for too long, the current international financial architecture has perpetuated structural inequalities, particularly for developing countries. The post-war institutions designed to promote global economic stability and growth no longer reflect today's geopolitical and economic realities. Many African countries continue to bear the weight of unsustainable debt, limited access to concessional financing, and the effects of global shocks beyond their control, from climate change to pandemics and global conflicts. We therefore welcome the commitments from various stakeholders for comprehensive reform of the global financial system. This reform should include governance reform of global financial institutions to strengthen representation of developing countries in international economic decision-making. Zambia further welcomes initiatives such as the Borrowers Forum to ensure fair and timely resolution of debt. Madam President, Zambia is both a least developed country, LDC, and a landlocked, or as we prefer, land-linked developing country, an LLDC. These two categories of countries face unique structural challenges. In July 2025, Zambia was privileged to host the LDC Future Forum in Lusaka, whose insights on building resilience to shocks and the need for innovation to address challenges were empowering. During the conference, our Republican President, Mr. Hakainde Hichilema, underscored the need for LDCs to build resilience by being more proactive and self-reliant. As a landlocked country, Zambia welcomes the Awaza Program of Action, which prioritizes structural transformation, trade facilitation, regional connectivity, resilience, and ICT infrastructure, which reflect our own priorities. We also welcome the Awaza's call for innovative financing. Landlocked need not mean isolated and encased. I repeat, Madam President, landlocked need not mean isolated and encased. As our President fondly states, LLDCs can become land-linked rather than landlocked, and we in Zambia are committed to making this vision a reality. Allow me to appeal, Madam President, that even as we reform the office of the High Representative for landlocked, for less developed countries, landlocked countries, and SIDS must be maintained. It is of imperative importance. Madam President, the theme of this session, Better Together, also compels us to reflect on the United Nations' readiness to address today's complex challenges. The Security Council's current composition and working methods reflect a bygone era and are overdue for reform. Decisions on critical peace and security issues are all too often stalled by the veto power of a few, even when the wider membership speaks clearly. Africa, with 1.4 billion people, still has no permanent seat, a historical injustice that must be rectified. Zambia therefore reaffirms the Common Africa position on Security Council reform as set out in the El Zulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. We call for comprehensive reform that expands both permanent and non-permanent membership to make the Council more equitable, effective, and reflective of today's world. Madam President, Excellencies, 80 years ago, the world emerged from war with a promise to never again allow division and destruction to define our collective future. That promise is being tested today. Let this 80th General Assembly be remembered as a turning point where the world chose solidarity over silence, justice over inertia, and unity over division. We must act not out of fear, but out of hope, not in isolation, but in solidarity, as we are better together. Madam President, Your Excellencies, I thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Zambia. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Anita Anund, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Canada.
President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, let me, Madam President, congratulate you on your election as President. Since the end of the Second World War, multilateral institutions have helped to make our world safer and more prosperous. More than 1 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. Famine and disease have declined. We see shared effort leading to shared prosperity. Pourtant, aujourd'hui,
however, today, the multilateral system is under threat. Some countries are turning more inward, looking at protectionism and unilateralism rather than multilateralism. Around the world, the geopolitical landscape is unstable. Those power is heading towards a way that is undermining, jeopardizing our security and prosperity. We are facing challenges that no country can address alone. Allow me to start with Canada itself, because the strength that we have abroad is based on resilience at home.
Proudly bilingual, resilient, dynamic democracy spanning 3 oceans, blessed with natural resources, and above all, defined by the ingenuity of our people. Our scientists are leaders in artificial intelligence and clean technology. Our workers are partnering in the global energy transition. Our entrepreneurs are advancing critical minerals, agriculture, and digital innovation. Canada is home to Indigenous peoples and to immigrants from every corner of the globe. Let me say a few words about Indigenous peoples on the eve of Canada's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. The voices of Indigenous peoples enrich our democracy at home and diplomacy abroad.
Their leadership has laid the foundations for the path followed by Canada and is strengthening our place in the world. Canada has for a long time been advocating for cooperation, diplomacy and international law. Whether this be a question of promoting peacekeeping operations of the UN during the Suez crisis, or indeed the Ottawa Treaty that prohibits anti-personnel mines, Canada has always been an innovative leader on global issues. This is something that still guides us.
Not shrink from global challenge. Canada does not retreat from duty. Canada does not walk away from building and strengthening peace. Even as the world changes, Canada remains a stable and reliable partner, both in business and collective security. At its core, our foreign policy rests on 3 pillars. First, defense and security, keeping Canadians safe, strengthening our sovereignty, being good allies and partners in NATO and NORAD. Second, economic resilience, diversifying trade, strengthening supply chains, being an attractive destination for capital, and an entrusted trading partner while advancing rules-based trade. And third, core values, promoting democracy and pluralism, balancing and maintaining human rights, fostering gender equality, protecting our environment, and working with Indigenous partners on sustainable development and prosperity while safeguarding our environment. But we face a changed reality. Rising unilateralism and protectionism weaken multilateral institutions and the rule of law, the very bedrock of the post-war order. À eux seuls.
In 2024 alone, 300 million people needed humanitarian assistance. 120 million were displaced. More than 40 million were refugees. Conflicts cost $14 trillion a year for the global economy. And each of these figures is not simply a statistic, but it's a child, a family, a community. Each and every one of them are just proof of why we must respect together the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, the Refugee Conventions, and Human Rights Conventions.
These stark realities, retreat is not an option. Canada will not turn inward. Canada will work to reform and strengthen multilateral institutions such as the United Nations so that they are more resilient and more effective in meeting the challenges of today and tomorrow. Canada is an Arctic nation. In the Arctic, a critical part of Canada and the world, climate change and new geopolitical pressures create both risks and responsibilities. Canada will safeguard its sovereignty, modernize NORAD with the United States, bolster NATO with fellow members, and work with Indigenous peoples to ensure that the Arctic remains a region of peace, cooperation, and sustainable development. The challenges to security are not confined to our own borders. Russia's 2022 illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine stands as a grave breach of the UN Charter. Russia's aggression, attacks on civilians, and abduction of children are flagrant violations of international law. Putin believed Ukraine would fall in 3 days. 3.5 years later, Ukraine still stands, its sovereignty intact, its people unbowed, its courage unbroken. Canada's position is clear. Putin cannot be permitted to redraw boundaries at his will. Might does not make right. Ukraine is not backing down, nor will its friends, including Canada.
In supporting Ukraine, we are not only defending a nation, we are defending the founding principles of sovereignty, dignity, and peace. Values that unite us all. Canada has already pledged $22 billion of various types of aid to Ukraine, and Ukraine can count on our long-term support. Here at the UN, last week, the Prime Minister Carney and President Zelensky reaffirmed our shared commitments, something that is shared by a large number of you here, to bring back Ukrainian children, bring them home.
The October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians was absolutely horrific. Hamas is a terrorist organization and an impediment to peace. Canada calls on Hamas to lay down its weapons and to release all remaining hostages immediately. The scope of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is catastrophic and requires urgent action. Canada has committed over $340 million in humanitarian aid, and are calling on Israel to help protect the civilian population of humanitarian aid at scale, and to ensure the two-state solution is eroding, as is evident in Israel's illegal expansion, reflects long-standing Canadian policy based on the right a commitment to a two-state solution. Live side by side in peace, continue their efforts to reach a ceasefire. Processes that must follow. Canada will participate. We are committed to efforts to strengthen the capacity of partners in the region. On Haiti.
In Haiti, violence is destroying lives and undermining stability. Canada supports the efforts made to tackle violence, put a stop to gang violence, and re-establish governance and open the way for stable democracy and a greater level of regional security. These struggles are not something that happens far away in today's interconnected world. Conflicts, indeed, that break out anywhere in the world affect all of us.
Global economy, Canada's diplomacy is also focused on delivering growth and economic resilience for our people. To grow our economy and create opportunities for our businesses, Canada is deepening partnerships in Europe, the Indo-Pacific, the Americas, and Africa. Recent progress includes a strategic defense partnership with the European Union, the Canada-Indonesia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, signed just last week, expanded agreements with Mexico, and continued leadership through key trade agreements such as the CPTPP and CETA. These are not just trade agreements. These are bridges of resilience, engines of prosperity, and commitments to the rules-based system that benefits us all. Through multilateralism, We can build an inclusive and sustainable global economy. And when multilateral institutions are under threat, Canada will not turn inward. We will lock arms with our partners to strengthen institutions, building their legitimacy and their efficacy to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. We are determined to forge new economic partnerships and leverage our competitive advantages in areas of economic strength. Canada will ensure that we utilize our diplomatic efforts abroad to the benefit of domestic interests as well. Alors que nous...
At a time when we're all looking to strengthen resilience, security and economic growth of our peoples, we cannot renounce or give up on our multilateral institutions and processes. Multilateralism remains our best hope to address global challenges. Rather than rejecting international norms, we should instead strengthen multilateralism by reforming its international institutions. This is the only way that international institutions will be able to address the challenges that we are all facing, while all the while providing results for our nations and peoples.
Have an opportunity to act with pragmatism and flexibility in our efforts to deal with collective challenges. That is good advice for all of us in our chamber here today. We need to bring together the representatives of those countries and entities that are both relevant to and affected by the crises at hand. As we have seen with the Coalition of the Willing for Ukraine, these efforts in support of the UN Charter need to become the new norm so that we can move forward on urgent challenges at scale and at speed. A generation of Canadians, including Canada's fierce and inspiring ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Rae, who has provided a lifetime of dedicated service to our country, helped to build these multilateral institutions. And I pay tribute to Bob for his lifetime of dedicated service to our country. Our goal will always be to prevent and to resolve international conflicts while modernizing global institutions so that they can meet the challenges of the future. To close, Canada is committed to leaving future generations not only a safer, more prosperous, more inclusive, and more peaceful world, but also a more sustainable one. Canada will be defined not by the strength of our values, but by the value of our strength. We know that no country can meet today's challenges alone. As former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan once said, in an era of global challenges, the world needs multilateralism now more than ever. No nation can solve its problems alone. This is the spirit of Canada, and Canadians are rising to the challenge. We will work toward a world where prosperity is shared, security is collective, and peace is lasting. This is Canada's pledge in this era of geopolitical challenge and change. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Miigwech.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Canada. I now give the floor to His Excellency Javier Bosoto, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Honduras.
Madam President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, Heads of State and of Government, Ambassadors, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I address you today on behalf of the Government of the Republic of Honduras and on behalf of President Iris Xiomara Castro Sarmiento, the first woman to lead the destiny of our nation, who recognizes the historic meaning of this General Assembly, which commemorates 80 years since the establishment of the United Nations. 8 decades have elapsed since humanity, in the wake of the horror of 2 world wars, decided to build a new legal, moral and political framework to preserve peace, protect fundamental rights, and build equal development between peoples. Today, in 2025, we need urgently to see if this foundational promise has been fulfilled, or, worse, if there is the risk of it being meaningless given the unprecedented challenges of the 21st century. Madam President, the world is not peaceful. The genocide in Gaza, the devastation in Ukraine, persistent violent crises, particularly in the Middle East, Africa and Haiti, the dangerous weapons business of global capitalism, all show the failure of the multilateral system to fulfill its essential mandate to achieve peace, to prevent barbarism, to stop the progression of the nuclear race, which major powers are engaged in and which could be the apocalypse of humanity. We categorically reject the fact that the most important decisions on peace and security throughout the world are hoarded in the hands of 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Their veto power, which has become an anachronistic privilege, has paralyzed collective action and the calls for peace in different parts of the world, and has allowed those committing war crimes to enjoy impunity. The UN cannot remain a hostage to special interests, nor can it be idly complicit in the face of the destruction of entire peoples. It is morally unacceptable that while billions of dollars are spent on weapons, budgets for peacekeeping operations, humanitarian aid, and sustainable development are being slashed. How can it be justified that the voice of 193 states who are present in this General Assembly and who are in favor of peace, to put an end to the different power blocks, can be cancelled out by one vote? We cannot continue to sustain a global order founded on privilege and inequality that leads to suffering for millions of poor people throughout the world. If we want the UN to survive as a guarantor of peace and not as an impotent bystander, we urgently need to reform its foundational charter. That is why Honduras joins the clamor of the Global South, demanding that the UN Charter be structurally changed to democratize the Security Council so that it once again has legitimacy, effectiveness, and justice for the nations of the world. To be clear, we are proposing the following. First of all, to broaden the composition of permanent members and non-permanent members, ensuring equitable regional representation therein. Secondly, we need to get rid of the veto, particularly when peace is looked for. and we need to ensure that this is particularly the case where there is genocide, war crimes, and widespread violations of human rights. Thirdly, we need to beef up the role of the General Assembly, providing the Assembly with more power, more binding power, in decisions pertaining to peace, security, and development. And finally, we need to open decision-making fora for women, indigenous peoples, youth, and diasporas, whose voice continues to be marginalized. Honduras is not accepting any more excuses. We will not remain silent in the face of injustice. The norms of the international order cannot continue to be defined by the logic of war, the hegemony of capital, or strategic workings of the most powerful. It must reflect the universal desire of people to live in peace, democracy, with dignity and freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, in Honduras we have embraced these principles. In these 3.5 years of democratic government, led by President Xiomara, by restructuring our institutions and upholding people's civil, political, and environmental rights. 12 years and 7 months on since the coup d'etat against the democratic president Manuel Zelaya in Honduras, back then, a drug dictatorship was installed, whose head, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was convicted in New York and sentenced to 45 years imprisonment for being part of a drug trafficking cartel to traffic drugs towards the United States. Public-private corruption, violence, and institutional deterioration were the instruments used by the Honduran oligarchy to continue exploiting our natural resources and our entire people. Our government has begun the process to recover from this episode by carrying out root and branch changes, focusing on the well-being of the majorities who were sacrificed by the drug dictatorship and historically excluded by the neoliberal economic model. This recovery has meant putting people's lives above business and putting education and health above privilege. Our progress has been clear. Poverty, which was 73% in 2021, has come down to 63% in 2024. And extreme poverty has been reduced from 54% to 40%. This means that more than 1 million people in Honduras have been lifted out of poverty in these 3 years. Inequality has also been reduced by almost 6 points on the Gini index. This is double what the previous government had achieved. In addition to this, the income of the 20% poorest, who had been sacrificed as a result of the looting and the indebtedness that had been carried out by the previous government, in contrast to this, in the administration of the democratic socialism of Xiomara Castro that we now have, these people have seen their income increase by 150%, and they now have access to health, sports, security, education, roads, agriculture, and energy provided free of charge. In terms of security, Honduras ended 2024 with a homicide rate of 26 for each 100,000 inhabitants. This is the lowest rate in 20 years. In the anti-corruption fight, we have opened our public finances to scrutiny from social audits. We have got rid of corrupt trust funds, and we have recovered our public goods. The tax justice law sent to the National Congress is part of our progressive tax reform, which aims to redistribute wealth for education, health, agriculture, and social protection, and it eliminates privileges given to the most powerful 25 economic groups and 10 families who monopolize 80% of the country's GDP and enjoyed generous tax breaks. In terms of gender, we have improved gender equality in decision-making. Our cabinet has equal representation of women and men, and we also have programs that have been rolled out to eradicate gender-based violence. Distinguished delegates, Honduras is striving to recover its forests. We have a zero deforestation program to 2030. In this effort, we have established 3 military battalions to protect our forests. Honduras is one of the countries that it suffers most as a result of climate change, even though we are one of the countries that contributes the least to global pollution. Droughts, devastating storms, a loss of biodiversity, and forced displacements are all open wounds that we have not caused, but which we are nevertheless paying with our lives and with our future. This is a struggle that we cannot carry out alone. Similarly, we reject the way in which migration is being criminalized, with harsher laws and more militarized borders. This road resolves nothing. It only perpetuates tragedy. It multiplies suffering, and it denies the fact that there is shared international responsibility to address a human and global phenomenon. People migrate as a result of unequal systems that have failed them for years, not because of their own choice. Criminalizing them means punishing them twice, first to poverty and then to exile. Colleagues, our foreign policy is based on our unwavering respect for sovereignty, the self-determination of people, and human rights. That is why we denounce the illegal unilateral sanctions that throttle economies and condemn people to misery. These measures, such as those imposed against Cuba for decades now, must cease immediately. We unreservedly condemn all forms of foreign occupation and threats of military interference in our hemisphere. They are totally unacceptable. Measures such as these mean denying people's rights to live in free sovereign states. This right is inalienable, and its recognition cannot continue to be postponed or manipulated. No rhetorical justification can legitimize the violation of sovereignty or the subjugation of nations. That is why today, before this General Assembly, we repeat our recognition of the State of Palestine, in line with our historic commitment and with our unwavering stance in favor of peace, security, and the coexistence of 2 states in the Middle East. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, this November, Honduras will hold general elections, which will be transparent, inclusive, and democratic. The government of President Xiomara Castro will ensure the free participation of all political sectors, respect for public freedoms, and the presence of regional and international electoral observation missions. Madam President, the United Nations must dare to change so as not to be a relic of the past, but rather the voice of the future. 80 years since its establishment, it is not enough to commemorate the past. It is now time to open fora for dialogue and hope for a better tomorrow that is still possible. Thank you very much.
I thank the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Honduras. I now give the floor to His Excellency Edward Bizimana, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Regional Integration and Development Cooperation of Burundi.
Monsieur le Président,
President, Secretary General, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I am taking the floor today on behalf of the President of the Republic of Burundi, His Excellency Evariste Ndayishimiye, who bestowed upon me the honour of representing him at this assembly and to share the views of Burundi. Today, as we mark the 80th anniversary of our organisation, something that we're celebrating, a standing election to preside over the 80th session of the General Assembly. And I assure her that she has the support of Burundi. I'd also like to take this opportunity to pay a well-deserved tribute to your predecessor, my brother Philemon Yang, and pay tribute to his admirable personal and professional qualities, and thank him for the exceptionally professional way in which he presided over the 79th session, which we have just successfully concluded. Finally, I would like to commend the courage of Mr. Antonio Guterres, who, for as long as he has been Secretary General of our organisation, has always advocated for the reform of the UN system to make it more effective and more credible. He also has the support and encouragements of Burundi. 80 years ago, the United Nations was born to a world ravaged by war. Its main mission was to preserve peace and foster cooperation between states and promote human rights. However, given what's happening today in some parts of the world, we should really be asking ourselves if the UN is still on this trajectory. Today, as we're marking this anniversary, I'm honoured to reaffirm Burundi's commitment to these founding ideals. The same ideals that have guided the UN's Charter since 1945. That shows the importance of the theme that is bringing us together this year. Far from being simply a slogan, it throws back to a historic need, a moral commitment, and indeed the only path towards a shared future. Indeed, as long as it has existed, the UN has made a great contribution to maintaining peace. It has supported ways of decolonisation. It has promoted international law, as well as the universality of human rights. It has fostered cooperation between nations and inspired generations of leaders and people. Burundi, which was once a beneficiary of this international solidarity, today is actively contributing to it, whether this be through peacekeeping troops, diplomatic engagement, or indeed using its voice within multilateral fora. Also, Burundi is a real-life example of resilience and of the return of peace. Our nation has gone through very difficult moments, but through and thanks to the will of its people and its strengthened institutions, Burundi was able to turn the page on conflict and choose instead the path of reconciliation, stability, and mutual respect. We created national transitional justice mechanisms with a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is painstakingly and courageously continuing its work, so that future generations will be able to build on solid foundations without hatred or a spirit or any search for vengeance. As a part of our candidate to be a Human Rights Council, we will stand against any politicisation of human rights. Thus, we denounce special mechanisms which are sometimes imposed on some countries, including Burundi, for rather subjective reasons. This is why I reiterate Burundi's request to withdraw the initiative to extend for the mandate of the famous human rights special rapporteur on human rights in my country, who for 10 years has been publishing subjective and biased reports on Burundi, as if Burundi and indeed time had stood still over the last 10 years. In Burundi, President, we have undertaken significant efforts to strengthen the rule of law, fight impunity, and promote civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights. Notable progress has been recognised by several partners, bilateral and multilateral partners, that is, as is shown by our constructive cooperation with multilateral partners. However, the Special Rapporteur seems to not have noticed this progress. But, as we all know, peace is only sustainable if development is there too. That's why Burundi has resolutely committed to implement the SDGs, paying particular attention to agriculture in order to create real food security. We're also focusing on education for all, health care, energy, the empowerment of women and young people, and environmental protection and other areas. This is the spirit that inspired our vision for Burundi with an emerging economy by 2040 and a developed economy by 2060. This vision is fully in line with the SDGs, and it is indeed, it shows our will to build a future where every citizen can prosper and actively contribute to the sustainable development of their country. President, ladies and gentlemen, as we celebrate 8 decades of our shared organisation, we cannot close our eyes and turn our back on the tension, ongoing or latent conflicts, the horrors that we're seeing in Gaza, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Sudan, in the Sahel, and in many other areas of the planet. The violence that we've been seeing recently, particularly the indifference and the cynicism that seem to be accompanying it, have reached such heights that we can't help but wonder where our humanity, where our empathy, where our sense of duty have gone. What happened to our commitment to cooperate for a better world? We need to have a heart of stone to remain indifferent to the suffering of the people in the DRC and in Gaza. When faced with this situation, Burundi believes that only a renewed and fair multilateralism can provide lasting responses to the many crises that we're facing. Geopolitical manoeuvring, calculations based on indifference, inaction, or on double standards or on egotism are dragging us into the abyss. This is why Burundi is appealing for peace. But for real peace. Not a peace that is selective, nor one that is subject to egotistical, self-serving interests. The peace that Burundi wants to see is a peace that's based on international law, on dialogue, and the respect of state sovereignty. President, neither peace nor human rights can prosper without social justice and without equality between nations. This is why Burundi stands side by side with its African partners and advocates for more just representation of Africa within decision-making bodies, particularly the Security Council. This is a condition for its legitimacy and effectiveness. How can an entire continent that has made such a contribution to the life and efforts of the UN be ignored in this way? Africa remains the only continent that for 80 years now has not had a permanent seat at the Security Council. In this connection, Burundi welcomes the ambitious UN 80 initiative, the initiative that seeks to strengthen effectiveness, coherence and relevance of the UN system. We share the conviction that 80 years after its creation, our organisation needs audacious and lucid modernisation. However, we wish to underscore the concerns expressed by numerous countries in the global south, particularly countries in Africa. It is crucial that this reform be member state-led, guided by a spirit of equal geographical representation, transparency, multilingualism, and the respect for regional priorities. Development, social and economic rights, the fight against inequality, climate action, and international solidarity must never be sidelined in the name of streamlining. A more effective UN, yes. A UN that's just reduced to budgets and technocratic work, no. Moreover, no reform of the UN system would overcome the question of political governance. We'd recall that the Security Council reform has been worked on for decades. It now is a question of justice. Africa has a united voice on this issue in the Eswatini consensus, is demanding that the historic injustice be corrected so that Africa can be fairly represented in decision-making bodies. It's not a favour, but it is a right, if we want the UN to remain loyal to itself. In summary, Burundi is supporting ambitious reform, but as long as it is inclusive, just, balanced, and focused on the real needs of people, rather than being a reform that's fashioned by external priorities. President, as we work to reform multilateralism, guided by justice, dialogue and truth, the recognition of historic injustice should be the bedrock upon which we build lasting peace. This is why Burundi would like to reaffirm the importance of the recognition of the genocide committed against the Hutu of Burundi in 1972. This is a question that's already been brought to the attention of this UN General Assembly during the 79th session. The memory, truth and reconciliation are powerful tools to rebuild society and to build peace. Silence cannot be an option when we're talking about restoring the dignity of victims and preventing from tragedies of the past from happening again. Thus, Burundi would humbly request the support of all UN member states and support for the recognition of this genocide. Before I conclude, President, I wish to reaffirm Burundi's will and its appeal to walk together towards a common future. This 80th session is a lot more than simply an anniversary. It's an appeal. We're at a crossroads, and the 80th session of our General Assembly must be a time for a moral awakening, solidarity, and for us to remember our shared humanity. The UN of tomorrow must be one that represents equity, justice, and action. It must reflect the realities of our world today to ensure that all voices are heard so that we can build lasting peace for present and future generations, as stipulated in the preamble of the UN Charter. Burundi is ready to continue to make its active contribution to establishing and maintaining peace, to consolidating the values of fair and inclusive development, as well as solidarity, mutual respect, and peaceful coexistence. Because yes, it is together and better together we'll be able to preserve peace, guarantee human rights, and ensure a dignified future for our children. It is a question of the credibility and the reputation of our shared organisation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Regional Integration and Development Cooperation of Burundi. I now give the floor to His Excellency Ahmed Attaf, Minister of State, Minister for Foreign Affairs, National Community Abroad, and African Affairs of Algeria.
Bismillah.
In the name of God, most compassionate, most merciful, Your Excellency, Mr. President, our United Nations organization celebrates its 80th year. And Algeria, together with the UN, celebrates the seventh decade of enlisting the issue of Algerian liberation on the program of this assembly. We celebrate these two memories in a global reality that is extremely turbulent and intricate. It is an international reality where conflicts have accumulated while settlements are absent, a reality where technological revolutions have proliferated while the development gap has expanded between the North and the South. A reality where instruments and treaties and commitments are abundant while implementation and commitment to their letter and spirit are scarce. In this complex situation, our organization is incapable and voiceless and marginalized. Its enshrined principles are violated, and its adopted resolutions are not implemented. Multilateralism that has been established by the United Nations is being manipulated by unilateral action and self-serving conflicts. The responsibility is entirely upon us, the member states, to restore respect for international law and to restore effectiveness to multilateralism. And we are similarly responsible for empowering the United Nations to restore its status as the beating heart of the international system based on the rule of law. The memory of establishing our United Nations must lead us to reflect on the most important issue on its agenda, which is the question of Palestine. The age of this question of Palestine is as old as the United Nations organization, and the legal essence of this issue takes root in the principles of the UN Charter. And the history of this issue is preserved in more than 1,000 resolutions who have recorded its essence and its legitimacy for more or through more than 900 resolutions adopted by the General Assembly and close to 100 resolutions adopted by the Security Council. The question of Palestine faces the greatest threat ever today, which is the threat of erasure through annexation and displacement, as well as through suffocating the legitimate institutions that represent the Palestinian question, and that may also eliminate the two-state solution that has been the consensus after the Israeli occupation is now loud and proud in its intention to revive what it calls Greater Israel. This situation makes it incumbent on the international community as a whole to uphold the action so that the seal of our 8th decade be the seal of Palestinian pain, catastrophes, and tragedies. It is the response of Palestinian neighbors, in particular Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan, the horrors promises. It is the responsibility to seek to preserve the two-state solution and to build a Palestinian state that is sovereign and independent on the borders of 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital, as a just and lasting settlement for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We appreciate the doctrine of the United Nations. The solution to this issue, in our opinion, must be based on 5 elements. One, that the solution take place under the permanent auspices of the United Nations. Second, that the solution be based on direct negotiations between the parties, the Kingdom of Morocco, and the Polisario Front. Third, that this solution be a result of the formulation of the parties and not imposed by any single party or any other party. Fourth, that this solution be aligned with UN principles on decolonization and on achieving justice for people under colonization. And fifth and finally, that the solution leads to empowering the Sahrawi people of exercising their right to self-determination as per UN resolutions. Also, in the direct neighborhood of my country, the Libyan crisis deepens and complicates further day by day. While the international community is losing interest in Libya, and while any practical prospects for a peaceful settlement is absent. 14 years after the start of the crisis, this sisterly nation remains trapped in divisions that are fueled and invested by foreign interventions, as per plots that do not desire the best for Libya or desire Libya's stability or security. If the matter was left to the Libyans alone, they would have reached an end to their divisions by now and would have charted a path forward that ends the crisis a long time ago. It is high time to end the foreign interventions in Libya in order for the resilient Libyan people to heal and reunite. Only then we would have paved the road to a consensus leading to a settlement and elections by which the Libyans would choose their representatives. Representatives who are loyal to the Libyan nation and the Libyan people. As for the Sahel region, Algeria reiterates its full commitment to the security and stability of our neighbors and to building the best and strongest relations and most mutually beneficial with our sisters and neighbors in the region. I note here that for the second year in a row, a member of the coup regime dares from Mali through this rostrum to attack Algeria. It is the height of rudeness and vulgarity by which this failed poet has spoken, and this coup plotter, it is only the illusion of a soldier and a lowly conduct that does not deserve anything but condescendence, and it only inspires disgust. And allow me to repeat this last statement in French.
The depth of perfidy, vulgarity, and coarseness reached by this false poet, but genuine coup plotter, are nothing more than brutish verbiage. His gutter talk deserves only scorn and inspires only disgust. I repeat, once again, the depth of perfidy, vulgarity, and coarseness reached by this false poet, but genuine coup plotter, are nothing more than brutish verbiage. His gutter talk deserves only scorn and inspires only disgust.
Instead of excelling in blaming others and distracting from one's own failures, we would have hoped that coarse soldier and his likes had excelled at other disciplines that are more noble and more beneficial for Mali, such as restoring security and stability in their country, or the skill of improving the living standards of the people in Mali, and finally the skill of empowering Mali with a governance that is befitting to its legacy and great history, a governance of competence and integrity, and that is loyal. The Republic of Mali deserves better than those coup plotters and conspirators. Algeria fully understands that this sisterly nation cannot be reduced to a few that do not aspire to a better people. The Algerian hand remains extended, and our efforts continue, and our patience will not run out. Connect us to the people of Mali. Our ties will not be shaken. Leaders. In the wider context of Africa, Algeria reiterates and recommits to its role in joint African efforts, in particular as Africa stands at a crossroads today. It is a critical juncture where on a juncture facing challenges on one side and opportunities on the other. The African reality makes it urgent to address the conflicts and crises that have not spared any part of the continent. Our continent is more vulnerable to the scourge of terrorism today, and the African reality makes it urgent to seize the opportunities to achieve integration and cooperation, including through the African continental trade zone, and working together for the betterment of our people. And the reality also requires the need to end decades of marginalization. The marginalization that our continent suffers in the different centers of decision-making in the world, starting with the Security Council and the World Bank and the IMF, as well as the World Trade Organization. In light of this reality, it is highly concerning that peacekeeping missions in Africa be targeted by a package of restrictions that limit missions' ability to carry out. Undermining the missions means undermining this essence and commitment to the collective security on which this organization is based. In the Euro-Mediterranean, Algeria continues upholding its responsibility as a constructive partner and as a reliable partner that is fully engaged in all the efforts that aim to achieve security and prosperity in this shared Mediterranean space. The most pressing challenge in the Mediterranean, represented in the trilogy of security, development, and illegal migration, requires the countries of the North Coast and the countries of the South Coast to adopt a comprehensive and inclusive approach that we hope will be the heart of what we call the new era for the Mediterranean. An approach that will restore to Euro-Mediterranean relations the balance in substance and in form. An approach that will make economic development on the southern front a shared priority in a strategic and urgent manner, and that will restore the balance of roles so that the countries of the north be a driver for growth and development within a balanced partnership based on investment and technology transfer and expanding the prospects of shared prosperity. For 2 years, Algeria has been privileged and has enjoyed the confidence of this General Assembly through its election as a non-permanent member in the Security Council. Here we are today, about to end this tenure, and we are hopeful that we have lived up to your confidence and have been loyal to the trust that you have granted us. The President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, desired for Algeria's membership in the UN Security Council to be a membership of loyalty to the principles and purposes of the United Nations Charter, a loyalty to Algerians' Arab and African belonging, and loyalty to Algeria's identity and its history of struggle for freedom.
وبناء على ذلك.
Accordingly, we have pursued with all our effort and sincerity to translate these commitments to actions through coordination with our African brothers and sisters within the A3 group and through cooperation with our partners within the wider group of the elected 10 members, and as well as through consulting all relevant actors of brotherly and sisterly nations and friendly nations outside the Security Council. We have attempted and exerted our utmost, where we have been successful at times and at other times have not achieved our desired goals. However, we have not surrendered and have never taken for granted a status quo. In our consolation is that Security Council's inability to address a lot of critical issues, at the forefront of which is the issue of Gaza, this incapacity did not silence the international conscience that is loudly heard in the overwhelming majority of the member states in the Security Council and in this UN General Assembly. The international conscience, overwhelming majority, and therefore Algeria is certain that hope remains alive for a better future. A better future for our United Nations, a better future for the international community, and a better future for the whole of humanity. Thank you all, and thank you, Madam President.
I thank the Minister of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Algeria. I now give the floor to His Excellency Denis Ronaldo Moncada Colindres, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Nicaragua.
Señor Presidente,
President and the people and government of the entire world. Here, as always, we bring the affectionate greetings of our heroic Nicaraguan people, who, as we know and as we say, understand battles, honor, and the glory of defending our principles and values, our sovereign dignity, our rights, and in particular, the sacred right to be free, and thus to choose our own cultural, social, economic, and political model, to make progress in the fight against poverty, faced with all the challenges of these difficult moments in the history of humanity. We stand here once again, proud of our brothers and sisters, our links with other combative, decent peoples, as are all the peoples of the world, peoples and families whom we defend, protect, and sustain in all of our prerogatives and beliefs, in all the cultures and practices that the colonialists and imperialists of the world have tried to attack, and which they have tried to steal from us, without being successful in that effort, and we know that they will not ever be successful in that effort. At this critical juncture, the dilemma is repeated, the eternal duality, the never-resolved conflict between peace and war, between life and death, between the supremacist attempt to appropriate our cultures and our duty to defend our spiritual, social, and material heritage. These are the times that define us. Either we're in favor of peace and life. For Nicaragua, blessed and always dignified, sovereign, free, there is no choice. We are life, health, strength, and steadfastness. When in proud and undefeated hope, we are light and truth, as our immortal General Sandino said, and we are also inspired conscience and courage, willing to serve the superior causes of humanity, the supreme good of all, concord, understanding, sensitivity, fraternity, coexistence and cooperation among all people, in order to share the goods that belong to everyone. The future is made of the glory of our people, who know that fighting and overcoming are synonyms, that struggle is the highest of all songs, and that to fight means creating the victories necessary for the common good. The human family demands respect and peace. The human family demands solidarity, inspired encounters between beings who are equal in every way and who are also complementary in every way. The human family demands respect for all of those agreements that were made 80 years ago when the United Nations was established in order to stop wars and to build lasting peace and justice, the treasure and patrimony of all human beings. The human family hopes, trusts, proposes, and at the same time insists on and demands union to reach the fullness of intelligence, serenity, wisdom, calm, and humility, indispensable to build and no longer to destroy. We are referring to all the issues that are priorities in our time: climate justice, compensation and reparations to those who have endured and suffered the misfortunes and evils brought about by selfishness and the greed of colonialism, imperialism, racism, and all of the abominable, disgraceful forms of oppression,